June 22, 1944. 0435 hours. 15 kilometers east of Rouen, France. A thin mist drifted over the flat farmland that bordered the double-tracked rail line feeding the enemy's forward armored groups. The air carried the faint smell of coal smoke from locomotives that had passed through during the night. Corporal Thomas Davies crouched near a hedgerow and studied the metal surface of the rail with controlled focus. He pressed his gloved hand against the steel to feel the temperature. The night chill still lingered, which meant the metal had contracted enough to hold tension. He noted the small beads of moisture along the web. Conditions were perfect for what he intended to do. His squad waited behind him, tense and uncertain, because they did not know why he carried a pouch full of common nails instead of explosives. They only knew that command expected them to slow a major convoy scheduled to push through this sector before dawn. Davies had spent his childhood in a Welsh mining town where every structure depended on iron. He learned to forge plow blades by age 12 and repair fractured pickaxes by 15. His father taught him how to read metal with his eyes and ears. A single tap could reveal internal stress. A single misaligned rivet could reveal why a beam failed. Before the war, he worked as a master blacksmith, shaping wrought iron gates and reinforcing industrial tools. When he enlisted, he carried that same precision into military service. His commanders noticed he rarely rushed a task. He always inspected tools before use. He studied enemy fortifications with the same patience he once used to study flawed steel. That patience formed the foundation of the tactic he now planned to use. The mission had a simple goal: sabotage the rail line that served as the primary artery for enemy armor. Doctrine dictated explosives for any rail operation. A shaped charge against the web. A demolition pack planted under the base plate. Or a timed charge hidden in a drainage ditch. Each method worked, but each carried problems. Charges required equipment that his squad did not have. They required time to set. They left obvious signs of sabotage. They also attracted patrols and risked counter-fire. In the open fields of Normandy, any loud blast meant immediate retaliation. Davies needed a way to weaken the rail quietly with materials he could carry in his pockets. He knelt beside the track and examined a point where the rail curved slightly to the left. Curves created lateral pressure. That pressure forced the web of the rail to bear more tension than on a straight section. A flaw introduced here would grow under weight and vibration. Davies tapped the steel with the back of his folding hammer. The sound was clean with no hollow resonance. Then he tapped again closer to the base. A faint change in tone hinted at a natural stress point. He nodded. This was where the rail would fail if pushed. His squad leader, Sergeant Markham, stepped forward. Markham was a practical man with combat experience in North Africa and Sicily. He respected initiative but wanted results that could be explained. He whispered that a locomotive weighing 50 tons would arrive within an hour. He asked why Davies needed nails. Davies responded that metal breaks when tension meets a precise flaw. He said he intended to give the rail a flaw that would not appear until the train rolled over it. Markham hesitated but allowed him to continue. Davies selected 6 nails. They were standard, thick-gauge steel nails taken from abandoned farm structures. He had spent the previous nights testing how many nails were needed to create the right wedge effect. Too few and the fracture would not reach the core. Too many and the deformation would become visible. 6 nails gave the best balance. He aligned them in a tight cluster and positioned them against the rail web about 9 centimeters above the base. He used his hammer to drive them in one strike at a time. Each strike pushed the nails deeper, compressing the metal fibers inward. The sound of each hit was low but sharp. His men listened in silence. When the nails formed a packed wedge, Davies shifted position and delivered a single heavy blow with the hammer head. The impact forced the nail cluster tight and sent a vibration through the steel. Davies knew from his years of forging that this vibration indicated a microfracture had begun to form inside the web. It would remain hidden from sight, thin as a line of hair under glass. No patrol would notice it. A locomotive hitting that point at speed would cause the failure to propagate instantly. He stepped back and inspected the surface. The nails sat flush with the contour of the web. Nothing looked unnatural. He wiped away tiny bits of metal dust with a cloth. Markham leaned in and asked how soon the rail would fail. Davies said it would not fail now. It would fail only when pressure, vibration, and weight aligned. He pointed out that the convoy's lead locomotive would apply the exact force needed. The steel would open along the fracture, splitting abruptly. That split would cause the wheel flange to drop, derailing the locomotive. The wreck would block the line and force the entire convoy to halt. A distant rumble signaled the start of the convoy's approach. The squad moved to a covered observation point behind the hedgerow. Davies watched the horizon. The first locomotive's headlamp appeared faintly through the mist. The engine moved fast because this line supplied armored divisions preparing to counter Allied landings. If the locomotive reached the front without delay, enemy tanks would reinforce vulnerable positions near Cannes. If Davies's method worked, that reinforcement would be delayed long enough to ease pressure on the Allied flank. The locomotive closed the distance. Davies felt tension build in his chest. He knew the fracture could propagate too early or too late. He knew the nails could slip under unexpected vibration. He also knew that if the rail absorbed the force instead of breaking, the convoy would pass through untouched. He watched the exact spot where he had driven the nails. The locomotive reached the curve. A deep metallic crack erupted from the rail, followed by the sharp grind of steel tearing open. The front wheel dropped as the fracture opened into a full split. The locomotive lurched violently and derailed in a spray of gravel and sparks. It skidded sideways and blocked both tracks. The convoy behind it braked in panic, but momentum forced several cars to collide with the wreck. Davies exhaled slowly. The tactic had worked. The first moments after the derailment created a chain of noise that echoed across the fields. Steel screeched against crushed stone. Coal spilled from the tender in a heavy cascade. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. German infantry leaped from the rear cars and tried to form a perimeter. Their officers shouted orders that blurred under the sound of the damaged engine settling into its final tilt. None of them understood what had caused the failure. They saw no blast crater. They saw no scorch marks. They saw no severed plates or torn fittings. The rail looked normal except for the sudden gap now visible where the web had split cleanly. That confusion bought critical minutes. Davies observed the chaos from behind the hedgerow. He counted the number of cars. He estimated the mix of equipment. Most were carrying supplies. 2 flatbeds carried armored vehicles. One carried ammunition crates. He noted the density of enemy soldiers around the command car. He knew that any counterattack from the convoy would not reach his squad unless they fired first. His team maintained silence. Their mission was not to engage. Their mission was to delay. Markham glanced at Davies with a look that mixed relief and disbelief. He had expected some result, but not a derailment so abrupt and complete. He whispered that command would want a detailed explanation. Davies simply nodded. He focused on the damaged rail. The fracture had propagated exactly along the stress lines he predicted. The opening had widened under the locomotive's weight. The wheel flange had dropped, guided by the sudden gap in the web. The force of the drop had leveraged the entire vehicle off the track. Years in a forge had taught him to see the path of fractures. War had given him a reason to apply those predictions. Enemy engineers arrived at the site. They inspected the rail and argued about the cause. One pointed to the curvature and blamed metal fatigue. Another blamed temperature change. They searched for signs of sabotage but found none. The nail cluster remained fused into the web, indistinguishable without removing the rail entirely. Even if they removed it, the nails would look like accidental debris pressed into a stress point. They needed tools, cranes, and time to clear the locomotive. They had none. The convoy blocked the junction, halting all traffic from the east. Davies and the squad slipped deeper into the hedgerow and regrouped. Markham needed a report for headquarters. He asked Davies to explain the principle again. Davies described it with the same direct clarity he used when teaching apprentices. Rails were designed to carry downward force. They resisted pressure from above. They resisted flexing along their length. They did not resist internal compression where the web met the base. That junction carried latent stress. If a flaw was introduced at the right angle, it turned into a fault line under weight. Nails acted as temporary wedges that forced the metal fibers to separate. A single heavy strike completed the hidden fracture. With the fracture in place, the rail waited for the train to deliver the final force. Each man listened with growing respect. They understood that this tactic was not luck. It was knowledge shaped by years of working steel. Soldiers often learn to improvise under pressure. Davies improvised with the accuracy of someone who had spent half his life predicting how metal failed. The squad retreated from the area using a tree line that paralleled the fields. They needed to move before enemy patrols expanded their search radius. Davies kept glancing back at the track. The wreck stood as a physical symbol of a simple idea applied with precision. He knew that the derailment would force the enemy to divert resources. He also knew that commanders on both sides viewed rail lines as the backbone of logistics. A single break in that backbone could disrupt entire operations. By dawn, the squad reached an abandoned farmhouse that served as their temporary observation post. From the attic window they could see smoke rising from the junction. German engineers struggled to separate the wrecked locomotive from the railed. They used jacks and blocks in attempts to lift sections of the engine. Troops guarded the area. Signals operators erected field antennas to report the stall. Command cars repositioned to coordinate local repairs. None of it moved with speed. The locomotive remained wedged against the crushed gravel. Markham contacted headquarters using a field radio from the attic. He reported the derailment. He emphasized that no explosives had been used. He said the method was silent, efficient, and relied on no special equipment. The radio operator on the other end did not believe him at first. He repeated the claim. Davies stood beside him and provided technical details. The operator fell silent after hearing the explanation. He said he would relay the information directly to divisional command. Davies sat on the floor and removed his gloves. He examined his knuckles. The force of the hammer strikes had bruised the skin through the leather. His hands ached with the familiar dull pain he used to feel after long days at the smithy. It reminded him of home. It reminded him of the heat from the forge, the sound of steel cooling in a quench bucket, and the weight of shaped metal resting on an anvil. War had taken that world from him. Yet fragments of that world had followed him here. He had not expected that the skill he learned in peace would determine success in battle. As the morning progressed, Allied units along the front line reported reduced pressure from enemy armor. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over the junction and confirmed the obstruction. The lead locomotive remained in place. The convoy behind it lacked the equipment to bypass the wreck. Tanks on the flatbeds could not maneuver around. Artillery pieces remained locked behind the jam. Enemy officers gathered near the command car in heated discussions. Davies picked up a field glass and studied the wreck from a distance. He observed the positions of engineers. He noted how they dug around the wheels. He noted how they attempted to lift the rail. He recognized the frustration in their movements. They needed cranes or heavy lifting vehicles from deeper in the rear. That equipment would take hours to arrive. Even then, the process would be slow. Tracks damaged by derailment required alignment checks. The web and base needed reinforcement before use. None of this could happen quickly. By midday, the delay reached command level. German officers transmitted urgent messages indicating that armored support would not reach the forward units in time. The Allied line, previously at risk of collapse at a weak junction near the Odin River, used the unexpected pause to reposition infantry, reinforce anti-tank guns, and dig deeper trenches. Commanders recognized the chance to stabilize the flank. Davies felt a quiet sense of vindication. His method had created the pause they needed. He knew the delay would influence the day's fighting. His squad observed the wreck until early afternoon. Then Markham ordered a withdrawal to avoid detection from roaming patrols. The men collected their gear and moved westward. Davies followed the path through a narrow corridor of trees. He kept thinking about the fracture inside the rail. How something invisible had changed the course of the morning. How a flaw measured in millimeters had halted a convoy measured in tons. He understood metal intimately. He knew that strength and weakness existed side by side. He also knew that sometimes the smallest act created the largest effect. The squad reached a wooded ridge overlooking a secondary road used by enemy patrols. Markham established a temporary camp among the trees. They would remain there until new orders arrived. The men ate ration biscuits in silence. The tension of the morning still clung to them. Davies kept his field glass close as he scanned the horizon for movement. By late afternoon, a runner arrived from the nearest Allied liaison point. He carried a sealed dispatch addressed to Sergeant Markham. Markham opened it, read the contents, and looked up with a measured expression. The message contained a direct request. Divisional engineers wanted a full technical breakdown of the sabotage method. They also wanted Davies transported to a forward command hut for debriefing. That meant the derailment had drawn serious attention. Markham handed Davies the dispatch. Davies read it carefully. The language was formal. Command wanted to determine whether the method could be replicated by other units. They also wanted to assess whether the tactic could be deployed along other rail lines feeding enemy armored reserves. Davies nodded and agreed to go. He understood that any method capable of delaying an armored convoy by several hours would interest senior officers. He also knew that scaling the technique required clear instructions. At dusk, 2 Allied scouts guided Davies and Markham through a network of orchards and hedgerows. They reached a small field camp consisting of canvas tents, a portable generator, and a communication truck with aerials raised like thin metal branches. Inside the main tent, several officers stood around a map table marked with colored pins and grease pencil lines. The air smelled of tobacco and damp canvas. A major greeted them and asked Davies to step forward. He introduced himself as the division's engineering officer. He had served in rail maintenance before the war and understood track mechanics. He asked Davies to describe every step of the nail cluster rail split. Davies explained the selection of the curve. He explained the identification of natural stress points. He explained the 6-nail configuration, the hammering pattern, and the final strike that induced the microfracture. The major listened with focused attention. Another officer asked why 6 nails instead of 5 or 7. Davies answered with precision. 5 nails failed to create enough concentrated pressure. 7 created a deformation visible to a passing patrol. 6 provided the right balance between pressure and concealment. He added that the nails had to be driven in a tight triangular cluster, not a straight line. A straight line would spread the force evenly and reduce fracture depth. A triangular cluster funneled the pressure into a narrow point that forced the internal separation. The officers exchanged glances. The major then asked a key question. Could the method be applied by men with no blacksmithing background? Davies considered it. He said that soldiers with basic training could learn the steps. They did not need expert knowledge, but they needed discipline. They needed to strike the nails with consistent force. They needed to position the cluster precisely. They needed to test the rail for internal tension before starting. He offered to create a written guide and demonstrate the technique to small teams. The major approved. He requested that Markham's squad remain nearby for the next 24 hours. They wanted Davies available for demonstrations. They also intended to send specialized units to observe the site of the derailment once it was safe. Their goal was to determine whether enemy engineers recognized the sabotage. If the enemy misidentified the cause as metal fatigue, the tactic could be used repeatedly without drawing suspicion. Outside the tent, night fog crept across the field. A generator hummed. Distant artillery thundered faintly. Davies walked to a supply crate and sat on the edge. His hands still ached from the earlier hammer strikes. A corporal from another unit approached him and asked whether the derailment had been a coincidence. Davies shook his head. He said steel obeyed predictable laws. When those laws were understood, outcomes could be engineered. The corporal nodded slowly, realizing that the explanation was not theory. It was practice shaped by years of labor. In the morning, the demonstration began. Engineers brought a spare section of rail salvaged from damaged track near the coast. They mounted it across 2 wooden supports to mimic field conditions. Officers, sappers, and reconnaissance soldiers gathered around. Davies stood near the rail with his tools laid out. He held the hammer, inspected its balance, and selected a fresh set of 6 nails. He positioned them in the triangular cluster and explained the angle of each nail. He explained how the hammer should strike with enough force to drive the nails as one unit. He explained how the steel should sound when the fracture formed. He demonstrated each step. The crowd listened. Some took notes. Others observed the rail carefully. When he delivered the final heavy strike, the vibration ran through the metal. Davies pointed to the subtle change in tone. He said that tone indicated internal separation. Most men did not hear it. The major asked Davies to repeat the strike so they could hear the difference between a healthy rail and a compromised one. Davies did so. The second strike revealed the deep shift. Now many understood. After the demonstration, the major ordered several teams to practice. They took turns striking the rail. They adjusted their technique under Davies's guidance. They learned how to angle the nails. They learned to listen for vibration. The major concluded that the method could be standardized. He instructed a stenographer to write a formal procedure based on Davies's explanations. Later that day, reconnaissance planes reported that the derailment still blocked the convoy. Enemy engineers had saved the locomotive from rolling completely onto its side, but they had not cleared the track. 2 additional trains from the east were now halted. Supply schedules were disrupted. Radio intercepts indicated that German armored elements complained about fuel shortages and delayed reinforcements. The delay had entered its 2nd day. Command recognized its strategic value. By evening, word spread quietly through the camp that the Allies had regained control of a defensive ridge previously considered lost. That ridge would have fallen under coordinated enemy pressure if the armored convoy had arrived on time. The pause created by the sabotage allowed reinforcements to reach the line. Infantry battalions dug in deeper. Anti-tank units repositioned. Artillery batteries established new fire lanes. All of this happened because a single rail split had forced the enemy to alter their timetable. Davies listened to the reports without reacting outwardly. Inside, he felt a sense of responsibility. His method had changed a battle's dynamics. Not through explosives, not through force, through understanding, through precision, through the predictable nature of steel under tension. His skill had become a tool in war. It was not a role he had ever imagined for himself. As night settled, the Major approached Davies with a final request for the day. He wanted Davies to prepare a second demonstration for a visiting group from a special operations detachment. They specialized in deep sabotage missions behind enemy lines. If they could learn the technique, they could disrupt rails far beyond the front. Davies agreed. He understood the value. He also knew that once others learned the method, it would no longer belong to him alone. It would become part of the broader arsenal of low-resource sabotage tools that shaped the course of the war. The Special Operations Detachment arrived before dawn. They moved with quiet discipline, their uniforms darkened by weeks of field work. Their commander introduced them as a team responsible for deep penetration missions, rail interdictions, and supply disruption. They specialized in stealth and precision. The commander listened as the Major explained the significance of the derailment. He looked at Davies with curiosity, expecting a demolition expert. Instead, he saw a quiet blacksmith in a standard infantry uniform. The demonstration took place near a railway maintenance shed that the engineers had repaired for training. A spare rail section rested on a steel support frame. Davies stood beside it, his tools laid out in exact order. The Special Operations Commander asked him to describe the theory behind the tactic. Davies spoke clearly. He explained that rail steel carried latent stress where the web met the base. He explained that introducing a subtle internal flaw caused a hidden fault line. He described how weight and vibration transformed the flaw into a split capable of derailing a locomotive. The detachment listened with attention shaped by experience. They understood the value of silence and sabotage. They understood the need for techniques that required no explosives. They understood that anything appearing natural confused enemy investigators. Davies demonstrated the nail cluster placement. He illustrated the triangular configuration. He addressed how striking the nails too lightly created no fracture, and striking too hard caused visible deformation. He delivered the final blow with the hammer. The sound carried the shift he recognized. The soldiers nodded when they heard it. The commander then asked the question that mattered most. How long did the fracture remain dormant before weight activated it? Davies answered that the fracture remained stable indefinitely until force acted upon it. He added that the best placement was on a curve, where lateral pressure amplified the split. On a straight rail, the fracture still worked, but the derailment occurred less violently. Curves multiplied the effect. The commander tested the nails himself. He repeated the technique under Davies's guidance. He adjusted his grip. He adjusted the angle. When he delivered the final strike, the vibration flowed through the rail. Davies confirmed that the fracture had formed. The commander looked satisfied. This was the kind of method that suited covert operations. It required no detonators. It required no timing devices. It required no specialized equipment. It fit into a pocket. After the demonstration, the detachment met with the Major inside the shed. They planned to deploy Davies's method on 2 rail lines feeding enemy reserves near the Seine. These lines carried tanks, ammunition, and fuel. A synchronized sabotage effort would force the Germans to reroute supplies. Rerouting consumed time. It created bottlenecks. It weakened the flow of material to frontline divisions. Meanwhile, enemy engineers at the original derailment site struggled to clear the wreck. They used jacks, pry bars, and pulleys. They tried to free the locomotive's wheel assembly from the crushed ballast. They made slow progress. At midday, reconnaissance flights confirmed that 1 track remained completely blocked. The second track suffered structural bending. Repair crews attempted to replace damaged ties, but the effort moved slowly due to the size of the wreck. Supply cars stretched back for hundreds of meters, forming a metallic chain that rendered the line unusable. By evening, the division command hut received intercepted communications indicating that German officers believed the derailment resulted from rail fatigue. They blamed weather shifts. They blamed vibration stress. They blamed poor maintenance. None suspected sabotage. This misinterpretation meant that the tactic could be used without raising alarms. The Major informed Davies that this misunderstanding was a strategic advantage. Later that night, the Major summoned Davies to a briefing tent. Several intelligence officers stood around a lantern-lit map table. They presented a plan for a secondary raid. A small team would infiltrate a rail junction 30 kilometers behind enemy lines. They wanted Davies to accompany them as an advisor. His role would be guidance, not combat. The team needed accuracy. They needed the ability to identify the best fracture points. They needed someone who could judge steel by sound. Davies considered the offer carefully. He was not trained for deep raids. He was an infantry corporal with specialized knowledge, not a commando. But he understood that the method would be more effective if applied correctly. He agreed to join the mission in an advisory capacity. The major informed him that the detachment would depart the next night. The following day moved quietly. Davies prepared his tools. He selected nails of uniform length. He cleaned the hammerhead. He practiced identifying fracture points on the spare rail. He knew the mission would require precision under pressure. He also knew that if enemy patrols detected them, the raid could end abruptly. At sundown, the detachment gathered near a tree line west of the camp. They carried silenced weapons, wire cutters, and minimal equipment. Davies wore standard gear but added a small pouch containing nails, a cloth, and his hammer. The commander outlined the route. They would cross a shallow river, slip through a section of abandoned farmland, and approach the rail junction from the north. The junction sat on a raised embankment with minimal guard presence at night. Their goal was to compromise two rails on a curve leading into the yard. The fractures would activate when the next morning's freight train passed through. They moved in silence. The moonlight pierced gaps between branches. Davies kept pace with the group. The mission reminded him that he had crossed a boundary. He was no longer simply applying his skill to a single sabotage task. He was now part of an operation designed to disrupt logistics across a wider front. They reached the river and crossed slowly. The water reached their knees and flowed with steady force. Davies focused on his footing. Once on the opposite bank, they moved through tall grass that swayed in the night air. They halted twice to evade passing patrols. The commander used hand signals. Davies followed instructions precisely. After 90 minutes, they reached a slope rising toward the rail embankment. The rails glinted faintly under scattered moonlight. A signal tower stood 30 meters away. A lone sentry occupied a platform. He scanned the area lazily. The group waited for him to turn away before moving forward. The commander directed Davies to examine a curve leading into the yard. Davies ran his fingers along the rail. He tapped the web lightly. He listened. He identified a point where internal stress concentrated. He pointed to it. The commander signaled for the team to form a perimeter. Davies knelt. He placed the nails. He drove them with controlled precision. The sound was soft. The final strike flowed through the steel. He felt the fracture form. He moved 3 meters down and repeated the process. 2 fractures increased the chance of derailment. They also maximized disruption in the yard, where track congestion multiplied delays. The mission ended without detection. The team withdrew along the same path, maintaining silence. Davies kept thinking about the invisible fractures left behind. They waited for pressure. They waited for weight. They waited for the train that would activate them. When the team returned to camp near dawn, the major awaited them. He asked Davies whether both rails had been compromised. Davies confirmed. The major nodded and sent scouts to positions overlooking the junction to observe the morning train. Davies rested briefly, knowing that the next phase depended on the accuracy of his work. At first light, the train approached the junction. Scouts watched through field glasses. The locomotive entered the curve. The fracture activated. The rail split open. The wheel dropped. The train derailed inside the yard, blocking multiple switching tracks. Scouts reported the derailment to the major. The major relayed the news to divisional command. The tactic had worked again. News of the second derailment spread rapidly within the division. Officers gathered around the map table and marked the blocked junction with a red grease pencil line. The disruption forced the enemy to redirect supplies through narrower, less efficient routes. Convoys stalled. Troop movements slowed. Fuel shortages increased across several sectors. Radio intercepts revealed frustration among German staff officers who could not understand why 2 separate rails failed in the same 24-hour period without explosions or patrol sightings. The major summoned Davies to the command hut for a formal briefing. Several intelligence officials and engineering officers waited inside. Their expressions showed respect. They understood the significance of coordinated rail failures that left no forensic evidence. They asked Davies to walk them through the entire method once more. He described each step with precision. He emphasized the importance of selecting curves. He explained how steel reacted under compression. He described the role of temperature. He addressed the need for a single heavy strike that activated the microfracture. An intelligence officer asked a critical question. Could enemy engineers eventually detect the sabotage? Davies answered honestly. If the nails were struck poorly, deformation would appear on the surface. If the nails were misaligned, the fracture would form incorrectly. He added that if enemy engineers removed the affected rail and examined the web closely, they might notice the nail impressions. But he stressed that such inspections required time and equipment rarely available near frontline logistics nodes. He concluded that the method would remain unnoticed if applied with discipline. The officers agreed. They requested that Davies assist in creating training materials for special operations units. They wanted written instructions, diagrams, and notes on stress behavior. They also asked him to oversee several more training sessions. Davies accepted the task. He understood that expanding the method's reach required clarity. His knowledge had to be precise and transferable. During the next 3 days, Davies worked with engineering staff to produce detailed sketches. He drew the rail cross-section. He marked the web and base. He illustrated the nail cluster configuration. He indicated ideal strike angles. He also drafted a step-by-step sequence that any trained soldier could follow. The sketches were technical but clear. They reflected his years at the forge, where apprentices learned through diagrams and demonstrations. The engineering staff compiled the material into a formal pamphlet. They intended to distribute it to units conducting sabotage missions along the Seine. Meanwhile, enemy activity at the original derailment site intensified. Scouts reported that heavy equipment finally arrived to lift the locomotive. The process moved slowly. Each attempt to shift the engine caused minor collapses in the ballast. Engineers tried to remove damaged ties, but the weight of the locomotive rendered their tools insufficient. Supply lines backing into the east remained stalled. The single derailment, now entering its 3rd day, continued to interfere with operations. At the second derailment site inside the rail yard, the situation was worse. The yard switching grid had jammed. Tracks bent. Signal cables snapped. Rail workers struggled to navigate the mess. It would take days to restore functionality. Supply officers argued with engineers. Commanders demanded updates. Confusion spread through the structure of the supply system. The derailments, invisible in origin, caused cascading consequences. On the evening of the 4th day, Divisional Headquarters received a report detailing reduced enemy pressure along the entire sector. Armored elements had failed to regroup as planned. Infantry units lacked ammunition. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Allied forces used the pause to fortify defensive positions and prepare countermeasures. Command credited the delay to multiple factors, but the rail sabotage played a central role. That night, the major gathered several officers and called Davies into the tent. They presented him with a recommendation for commendation. The document stated that his innovation had created a tactical advantage that preserved Allied lines during a critical phase of the campaign. Davies read it quietly. His expression remained neutral, but the recognition carried weight. He did not seek praise. He sought effectiveness. But he understood that recognition ensured the method would be taken seriously at higher levels. The next morning, Davies returned to the training area. A fresh group of special operations personnel awaited instruction. He repeated the demonstration. He guided them through the strikes. He corrected their grip. He explained that consistency mattered more than strength. He taught them how to read steel, a skill learned through years of repetition. Several men succeeded in producing the correct internal fracture. Others struggled. Davies repeated the technique until each man understood the sound of a compromised rail. After the session, the major informed Davies that command intended to send him to a rear area facility to train additional teams. They wanted to formalize the method under controlled conditions. Davies listened and considered the request carefully. He understood the strategic value. But he also felt a pull toward his squad. He preferred field operations to administrative duties. He did not enjoy the idea of leaving his unit behind. Markham approached him later that evening. The sergeant told him that the squad supported whatever decision he made. They respected his skill. They had seen its impact. They also knew the war needed precision more than familiarity. Davies appreciated their trust. He told Markham that he would follow command's directive. The war demanded flexibility. 2 days later, Davies traveled to a temporary logistics facility near the coast where engineers assembled rail sections for training. The facility contained rows of metal racks, crates of nails, and several hammers lined neatly on a table. Officers awaited Davies's instruction. Over the next week he trained multiple teams. Each team practiced creating fractures under supervision. Davies corrected mistakes. He coached them through difficulties. He ensured that each soldier understood the principle, not just the steps. By the end of the week, several teams demonstrated consistent accuracy. They deployed toward sabotage missions across the region. Davies observed their confidence. He knew the technique had become independent of him. That independence meant the method would continue to influence the battlefield. While training continued, Davies received sporadic reports from the original front. The destroyed locomotive had finally been moved, but the railbed remained damaged. Engineers rebuilt sections of the line under pressure, but the disruption persisted. Allied intelligence noted that the delay affected supply schedules across two adjacent sectors. Enemy officers expressed frustration in intercepted communications. They questioned maintenance practices. They emphasized speed, not caution. They continued to misdiagnose the sabotage as metal fatigue. One night, as Davies prepared to conclude a training session, a junior officer approached him with a question. He asked why a simple cluster of nails could outperform sophisticated explosive charges. Davies answered without hesitation. Explosives created obvious destruction. Nails created internal failure. One was a visible force. The other was a silent pressure that exploited natural weakness. Steel hid its tensions until pushed. That hidden tension, when understood, became a weapon. The officer nodded slowly, realizing the simplicity and the power of the idea. Davies walked outside the tent and looked toward the horizon. Allied artillery flashes lit distant clouds. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke. The war continued with relentless force. But he understood that ingenuity altered the course of battles as much as firepower. His contribution had come not from rank or command authority, but from the precision of a craftsman who learned to read metal long before he learned to carry a rifle. The story of the rail split would not appear in official reports. It would not be celebrated in newspapers. It would remain a small detail tucked within the larger movement of armies. But its impact was real. Trains delayed. Convoys stalled. Lives preserved. The method accomplished what doctrine could not. It turned knowledge into advantage. And in a war defined by machinery and mass, a single fracture measured in millimeters had shifted the balance of an entire sector. Davies knew that when the war ended, he would return to a quiet forge somewhere far from rail lines and battlefields. But for now he served the only way he could. Through precision. Through understanding. Through the silent manipulation of steel under tension. The weeks that followed carried the war deeper into France. Allied forces pushed east with steady pressure. Rail networks remained a priority target. Special operations teams trained by Davies executed silent sabotage missions across multiple junctions. Each successful fracture derailed or delayed a supply train. Some disruptions lasted hours. Others lasted days. Enemy engineers struggled to diagnose the cause. They blamed poor maintenance. They blamed rushed construction. They never identified the nail cluster technique. Davies received regular updates from field units. Several credited the method for disrupting enemy reinforcements during critical engagements. One report described a panzer column forced to halt for 12 hours because a locomotive derailed on a curve near a river bridge. Another described an ammunition convoy stranded on a rural line after a fracture activated beneath the lead car. The delays accumulated. Enemy divisions received fewer supplies. Allied advances accelerated. Despite the growing influence of the method, Davies maintained a modest presence. He avoided attention. He focused on training. He corrected mistakes. He answered questions with precision. Officers noted that his explanations were consistent and practical. He never exaggerated. He never presented the method as more than it was. A simple act applied with discipline. Eventually, headquarters informed him that his work at the training facility was complete. Teams across multiple sectors understood the method. They could apply it without supervision. His role as an instructor was no longer needed. He was free to return to his squad. Davies packed his tools. He stored the hammer carefully. He took the remaining nails and placed them into a small pouch. They were reminders of the work he had done. When he reached his unit, Markham greeted him with a firm handshake. The squad welcomed him back. Their faces reflected the fatigue of constant movement, but also the steady determination of men who had survived difficult weeks. Davies resumed his position within the group as if he had never left. He returned to the rhythm of patrols, observation posts, and quiet moments between engagements. One evening, as the squad set camp near a forest edge, Markham sat beside Davies and spoke plainly. He said that command had mentioned Davies in briefings. He said officers understood that a single innovation had influenced an entire sector. Davies listened. He acknowledged the comment with a simple nod. He did not seek recognition. He valued results. He valued precision. The derailments had achieved their purpose. That was enough. As the fire crackled, Davies thought about the rail lines he had weakened, the fractures he had created, and the trains that had stalled. He thought about the lives saved because enemy armor arrived late. He thought about the quiet power of knowledge applied at the right moment. The war would continue. The front would shift. New strategies would emerge. But the method he created would remain a quiet part of the campaign. A low-resource solution that shaped operations without drawing attention. In the years after the war, few would know his name. Fewer still would understand how a blacksmith's understanding of steel had changed the movement of armies. But those who served beside him remembered the precision of his work. They remembered the silent fracture that stopped the convoy. They remembered how one craftsman's insight became a weapon when nothing else could achieve the needed result. Davies carried that memory forward. Not as a point of pride, but as proof that skill mattered. Knowledge mattered. And sometimes a single idea, applied with accuracy, could shift the course of a battle measured in thousands of lives.